Hello, I am Chiqui Cartagena, the Chief Marketing Officer of the Conference Board. Just a few months ago, the economy was booming. The world's residents were going about their daily activities, and companies carried out business as usual. Then COVID 19 shut down the world, and in the United States, the death of George Floyd sparked weeks of social unrest. As a result, we are now in the midst of a sea change in social consciousness. How are global companies expected to address these issues? A disease that strikes the disadvantaged hardest, exposing underlying issues of economic and educational inequality, overlaid with unanswered questions around decades of simmering racial injustice. For over 100 years, the Conference Board has helped the world's leading companies and society at large navigate crises and develop reasoned solutions for our country. Given the events of the past few weeks, the Conference Board is building on its historical role and launching a series of CEO forums to foster action called Building a More Civil and Just Society. CEOs remain one of the most trusted groups in America, and their personal and corporate actions have the ability to drive this discussion and to inspire change in our country. In line with our tradition of convening leaders around critical issues facing society, we are pleased to launch this series with our own CEO, Steve Otterman, as he interviews four of our nation's leading CEOs: Roger Ferguson, President and CEO of TIAA; Joanne Jenkins, CEO of AARP; Gabby Sulzberger, General Partner of RC Fontis; and Ron Williams, CEO of RW2, and of course, the former CEO of Aetna. Let us begin with Steve and Roger Ferguson.
We're very fortunate today to have Roger Ferguson join us. Roger Ferguson is the former Vice Chairman of the Board of Governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System, the current President and Chief Executive Officer of TIAA, which is the leading provider of retirement services in academic, research, medical, and cultural fields, and a Fortune 100 financial service organization. Roger also is the chair of the Conference Board, so we're very lucky to have him as part of our organization. Roger, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Steve, thank you very, very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this very important topic.
You know, Roger, given the events that followed the death of George Floyd, how would you characterize the social state of our union today?
I think the social state of our union, unfortunately, is not good. You know, go back to the Lincoln speech about a house divided against itself, and that's really what this feels like. Having said that, I'd also say I find some reasons for hope in the following sense. When we look at the peaceful protests, and the vast majority of them are peaceful, similar to some in the 50s and 60s, what we're seeing is a broad swath of America coming together around the same set of issues and concerns around social justice and inequality and racism, et cetera. And so while I'd say, roughly speaking, you know, the social fabric of the country is being torn asunder, there may be some signs of folks trying to, you know, sort of stitch it back together, if I could keep the analogy going. So generally speaking, not good, but maybe some signs of hope.
Though painful, I actually am encouraged. And, you know, it's because both the quantity, but even more so the quality of the conversation and discourse around this just feels really palpably different than, you know, in the past. And unfortunately, events like this have happened over the last, you know, Trayvon Martin, and just there've been a number of just terrible incidences. But this particular set of events really, I think, struck a chord. And I'm actually hearkened to the civil rights movement, which, you know, you tend to think about like kind of these main events, but it was over years that, you know, the leaders during that time really struggled, and they were discouraged, and there were setbacks, and we didn't think we were getting anywhere. And then it turned out that there were a couple of pivotal moments, points of inflection that, you know, it was only in retrospect that we realized what was the part of a tipping point in the movement, you know. So Rosa Parks, when she got on that bus, she didn't know that, you know, that was going to end up being, or, you know, she just could have been just put to the back of the bus like it happened many other times before, or when those kids sat in at that luncheonette. So I really do believe that this set of events, we're going to look back and believe that this is part of the story, which was the beginning of some enduring change. And it makes me actually quite optimistic. And the last thing that I'll say that also gives me this sense of optimism is, you know, these millennials, they're amazing. And so there are a lot of ways, you know, they're challenged, you know, as employers and, you know, but they have a real sense of justice and equity, and they grew up in ways that were different. They don't have some of the baggage that we grew up with. And so I'm really encouraged by kind of the actions that I see them taking, the statements that they're making, the depth to which they are, you know, feeling a sense of commitment around this. And it also leaves me very much encouraged.
The nation is really confronting something that has been longstanding. And I think there's a general awareness that we are seeing among the broader population. You know, historically, the civil rights movement was really a movement driven by a combination of the Black or African American community with liberal progressive members of the broader community who really saw the injustices. Now what we're seeing is a much broader coalition of people who really understand where we are and what we need to do. And I think that is really quite encouraging to me, both as an executive. I think there's a huge opportunity for talent. You know, I am one of 20 people who is African American who's been a CEO of a major company. And I can tell you, I'm good, but I'm not that good to be only one of 20. That there's an enormous amount of human capital that is being wasted because we're not giving people the opportunity to demonstrate the impact they can have on business and our society. I've long been a supporter of the Conference Board, and I believe now is an opportune time for the Conference Board to assume its historic leadership position in helping corporations find their way through a set of very challenging issues. I think the year started off with a good economic situation. This was the best economy I have seen in my career. And all of a sudden we found ourselves with the absolute worst economy I have ever seen. And I think companies and people were struggling with that health pandemic. And then all of a sudden on top of that, we've had a series of incidents which have illustrated the issue of the police violence, social injustice in the context that people are not all treated fairly and equitably. And I think it's clear that corporations have a lot more to do in the area of social justice as well as diversity and inclusion.
Obviously, this has been a very emotional time these last several weeks. I would probably characterize it as in a state of motion. I think that we're seeing signs of a transformation and change. I'm moved by the diversity of the age groups that we're seeing at these protests all across the country. I'm moved by the diversity of racial breakdown. Rarely have you ever seen a movement of this type that spreads around the globe, and that you're seeing demanding action, not just from those who have been oppressed, as in Black people, but also how important it is to have young people all across this country engaged in this conversation. You know, and I tell my colleagues and friends that this feels different because there's this enormous recognition from other races and socioeconomic groups all across this country that we can do better than this.
The issues of racism and inequity, unfortunately, are not new to our society, nor is the civil unrest that we're seeing now. Of course, you know, you and I remember the 60s, and I was just so hopeful that following that decade, and particularly the events of 1968, that things would be different. But here we are again, it seems. But is this time different? is it possible, Joanne, that lasting positive change might be possible because of the events of the day?
When I think about what's from the 60s, I can see some change. I think we saw change in the 60s and leading up into the 70s, and then it's almost like we became complacent about assuming that we had equal rights and equal access to work and equal access to pay and to employment and all of those other kind of things. And it almost seems like there was this complacency among a broad spectrum. I often talk about it in terms of what I call the 3 Ps: the public responsibility, the private sector's responsibility, and how we as individuals have a personal responsibility to move the agenda along. And so, as I look at where we are now, I don't think we're going to make long-term systemic change unless all 3 of those parts of society see what's happening and try to make changes at all 3 levels. This is going to take all of us working together to bring about the change that's needed so badly in this country.
My experience about what's going on right now, and so I'm just one person, so this is just, but is that the quality of conversation that I'm hearing in my boardrooms and in conversation with my CEO, and we can talk about this later, it is really different, and that there is a sense and a commitment to making organizational changes that are structural, that are deep, and that I do think will endure. So I do think that this is slightly different.
Well, I'm an optimist, and I have to be. And I think that what's different this time is really video. I think that many of the things that people have reported over and over and over again were not recorded on video. And so it was easy to say, well, you're too sensitive. I'm not really sure that's what happened. But when you see the kinds of things that happened with George Floyd, when you see the kinds of things that happened in Central Park with the woman who basically was calling the police on someone who simply asked her to leash her dog in an area where that was required, the average person can see that there is a level of behavior and a level of lack of fair play that has dire consequences. The way I try to describe it is when you're an African-American male and you have an interaction with the police, you don't know if this is one of the thousands of good policemen who are going to treat you fairly and equitably and judge you by your actions and what you've done, or whether you are dealing with someone who is the equivalent of an IED and who may result in an enormous explosion that can have dire consequences for you. That's a risk you don't run. It's a risk my son runs. And it's a risk that I think people are now understanding. Most police are great. They do a terrific job. It's not a job that I would want to do. And we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. But I think the video is what's different. It brings the reality to people. I think the pandemic is different because it's demonstrated to us that the most vulnerable in our society, those who are low income, low wages, primarily people of color in many communities, are in fact experiencing much higher death rates and impact rates. And it's due to the disparities in healthcare and the quality of healthcare services people receive.
One can hope, but having lived through the 60s, you also know that hope can fade. What I find interesting about this time, as I said earlier, is we already seem to be in a multiracial, multi-ethnic dialogue and discussion. I do believe, as I see what's going on in my own company and other places, that there is more dialogue and discussion going on. And that maybe will generate some reasons for hope. The other thing I find, importantly different here is that America itself is on the cusp of becoming a much more diverse organization. We're soon going to be, as you know, majority minority. And that, I think, has to give us some sense that maybe the future might be different from the past, because the future is going to look really quite different in terms of that next generation or the one behind it. So people are emerging, I think, quite literally, one generation after another in a world that's quite different. So, two reasons maybe to be more optimistic. America itself is changing and becoming a much more diverse society, where one can hope becomes harder to be, sort of overly, racially antagonistic. And secondly, I think the nature of the dialogue this time feels to me, in some sense, more raw, more honest, a recognition of privilege, a recognition of, perhaps systemic racism. And some of this occurs in part because we also are confronting not just the issues around George Floyd and far too many other names, but we're also confronting, a pandemic that has shown us both how we're all vulnerable, and at the same time, we see dramatic racial disparities there. We're only 12 or 13% of Americans are African American, but about 20 to 25% of those impacted by COVID-19 are African American. So the entire psyche of America, I hope, is focused in on this amazing racial difference in health outcomes, as well as all the other things that we're talking about. So one should never give up hope, and maybe there are 2 or 3 reasons to think why this time might be somewhat different.
The data is the data, and the facts are that we haven't made a lot of progress, in terms of people of color. I think in some categories of social justice, we've made a lot of progress. I think we're doing a lot better with women and some of those income disparities. My daughter is gay. I believe that the life experiences she's having are much different and better than, would have been true for 10 or 20 years ago. But if you're Black in America, it's the jury's really out. In fact, the jury is saying that, we haven't made a lot of progress.
Gabby, when I think anybody in America looks at the video of George Floyd and realizes what's going on there, it is just so clearly wrong. And I think, there's consensus on that sort of that action, but that is an extreme. I think what is probably less apparent to certainly the general population is what goes on every single day. Can you share with us any personal experiences you've had with social injustices and maybe examples that have affected you personally?
Yeah. So when I graduated from school many moons ago, and I was interested in entering the world of private equity and venture capital, I was pretty naive, so I went to Princeton and Harvard, JD MBA, and had worked at Bain and all this kind of stuff. And so I just kind of assumed I would be able to, in a reasonable amount of time, get a job. So that was my first experience hitting up against, this wall, which was a club. The club of private equity and venture capital, which was then almost entirely white male. So I didn't know at the time I was the first Black woman trying to get into the industry, but it took some time and a lot of rejection. And and I was fortunate that I was given some opportunities. And so it's an industry that, I have found personally interesting and gratifying, but I also think it's really an important industry because it provides a very important class of capital to an entrepreneurial sector, risk capital. And so to the extent it is this white male club or was this white male club, then it had implications for a much broader group of people and entrepreneurs because of the barriers it created, as a result of not having this access to this form of capital. In any event, so flash forward 30 years later, I have a daughter who went to Stanford, great GPA and the whole bit, graduated from Harvard Business School last June, and she decides that she, wants to also work in this world of venture capital. And I think the thing that has been most painful for me is that the world she's encountered isn't that different. So, you know, HBS sponsors these day-long treks where the kids get to, you know, meet with all, you know, a dozen different venture capital firms and all this kind of stuff. And she came back from this day having not seen one Black person the whole day. And I would say objectively that the amount of rejection that she's gotten was not actually that different than what I experienced 30, you know, some years ago.
I think I don't want to trivialize the death of George Floyd, but I think there are experiences that many executives have had. You have to understand, when people know you and they know the kind of accomplishments you've had, you're treated one way. The minute you leave that environment and you go out, you're just another African-American male in the community. For example, the number of times someone has pulled up in front of a restaurant where I was standing outside and handed me the keys because they thought I was a parking lot attendant. I don't know how many times that's happened to you. I don't know how many times you've been at an event in black tie when someone thinks you're the waiter and asks you to bring them a drink. The number of times, which is a classic incident, when I was CEO of Aetna, we were traveling. It was a very important transaction. We were traveling by private plane. We go to the FBO, the flight center, and we get out of the car, and there's a bus that's going to take us out to the plane. I'm going into the FBO. Next to me is a guy in shorts and with his hat on backwards. And as I go into the FBO, the person at the front door says, "Where are you going?" And I say, "Well, to the restroom." And he looks at me and he says, "Well, the driver's restroom is around the side." And I ask him, "What makes you think I'm a driver? I'm in a suit, a tie, and the guy next to me is in shorts with his hat on backwards. But somehow or another, you think I am a driver and not a person with a private plane."
Well, I'll share an example that I shared with my leadership team 2 weeks ago. So as part of our conversations inside of AARP, I've spoken to my board about this issue, spoken to my leadership team, and then we ultimately had a conversation with all 2,400 employees around the country. And I used this example to say that my daughter was home from college. She's at school up in Wharton in Pennsylvania, and she was home for my husband's birthday. And my son, Chris, who's 30, offered to drive her back the next morning to be able to go through. And we went to sleep, and I woke up the next morning and I said to my husband, "I have been up all night thinking I feel so uncomfortable with Christian driving back from Philadelphia in a car by himself." And my husband said, "I was thinking the same thing." So, you know, we grouped together and got on the phone with my son, and we made the decision to put my daughter on Amtrak and risk exposure to COVID than to have my Black son drive in a car by himself from Philadelphia at night. And that wasn't 30 years ago. That was 2 weeks ago.
Here I am, CEO of a Fortune 100 company, having been in government service. I've been invited to social events at country clubs where, you know, a number of CEOs and spouses were gathered. And I recall at one of these events, you know, I walked away from the table with my friends and peers, and one of the other people in this country club where I was a guest beckoned me over, thinking I was a waiter, and said, "Well, I've just dropped my spoon here. Would you be kind enough to get me another?" And, you know, certainly I've been in stores where, you know, the security guard took an extra moment to watch me come in. And so one should not think that even, you know, a person who's a former public servant and an active participant in the CEO community is immune from racism. It happens, you know, all too often. And it's those little small reminders that maybe someone thinks that you really don't belong. And so I think, you know, all of us have, you know, unfortunately, you know, one or more of those kinds of little micro racisms that add up to a sense that, you know, society really may not want us, regardless of how accomplished we may be.
Yeah, those stories are just heartbreaking, and it says that we're probably further away as a society than most of us really understand. So then that kind of raises the question, what needs to happen here? I mean, we've been through all these traumas, but what needs to happen in this country to establish a truly just society? What changes need to be made, and who needs to make them? Is it, how much of it is driven by business? How much of it's driven by government or other people?
Well, look, anything that's as deeply ingrained as racism is in American history, or goes back to before the United States existed, requires, in order to eradicate that, requires intentional, consistent, persistent activity for all of us. So individuals really need to look into themselves to figure out, what are those moments when perhaps they have, acted in a way that clearly suggested a certain kind of racism, discrimination. One of these small little items, when did you stand in front of someone in line and they say, well, I'm standing here, and you said to them, oh, I didn't see you. And you suddenly realize that that person you didn't see was a person of color. So individuals have to recognize that they are, in some sense, part of the problem. Government has a role to play, because this racism that we're dealing with has resulted in remarkable socioeconomic inequalities. Black families have roughly 1/10 of the wealth of white families. It turns out that a high school educated person on average white person will make more than a college educated African American person. We just talked about the health disparities. So many places one looks at. And some of those disparities in outcome, are the result of government policies, and some of them can be rectified by government policies. And then we in the private sector have to look at our own organizations and saying, gee, are our African American colleagues being given the opportunity for promotion as much as everyone else? Are the ratings that we're using to describe whether or not someone is superior or average or above average or below average, are those distributions of those ratings fair and equitable? Do we take aggressive action against, the kinds of things that might happen in the workplace that make people feel uncomfortable?
The Black Corporate Directors organization, I think, is doing some of the best, most leadership work, on this. And the way they've kind of categorized it is 3 Ps: people, philanthropy, and purchasing. And all 3 are really important areas for us as board members, for us as leaders of organizations. But one, understanding, what is happening with our people, what are we doing with regard to recruitment, retention, and most importantly, development. When we look around, it's true for me that in, unfortunately, many of my boards, when I look around the C-suite, there just isn't diversity. And so that can take a while to fix, but we need to, as board members, understand what is happening, what's the plan in order, to do so. And then more broadly, what's happening with, all of our different kind of categories of employees, and really fully understanding, to the extent there is income disparity, why that is so, and what we're doing to address it. Because if we can really address income inequality in corporate America, that's kind of where it starts, and we really can make a difference, because that then is the foundation, or the reason that's creating a whole other host of issues, as we know. Secondly, our philanthropy, and that's also a very important way as our companies, are able to play a leadership role. And, for my boards, it's been very important that there's not kind of this one and done mentality, that to the extent we are making commitments, that they need to be multi-year commitments. There are a lot of organizations right now that are wonderful organizations, but they're getting windfalls of money. And what's important to make sure that these organizations stay around for a long time is, one, that they have support around that and deploying that capital, but also making sure that, that this is a commitment that will go over several years, that they can really begin and have structural change within their organizations. The third area is purchasing. And you know, at BCDC, we like to describe it as instead of we used to call it supplier diversity, but we really like to think about it as business diversity, because the supply chain has really changed and evolved. And if we're not creating jobs, you know, around all the different categories of employment that, and supporting businesses, professional services, for example, where real wealth is created, then again, we need to kind of rethink what we're doing in this area of business diversity. So all three categories are ways, you know, are the companies that we work with. And, you know, in my case, if it's MasterCard or, you know, Brixmor, or, you know, we're having very real tactical conversations about changes that we can put in place that will have not only impact, but enduring impact.
What I keep saying, you know, in the conversations I'm having, that it's not just one thing that has to occur. I mean, you've seen some local governments reacting and trying to make changes. But I think also what's been so moving about this is hearing from my white colleagues and friends about, I had no idea, or you know, I felt so uninformed about what was happening and what Black people were experiencing in this country. Or I decided I know my family makes these comments that are negative or whatever, but my rationale and the way I've dealt with it is sort of to ignore it. And I now realize that I can't ignore it. I have to be involved in the conversation, and we have to, all of us, learn and listen to each other every day for us to move past this. And so obviously, you know, it's going to be broad based in terms of, you know, setting a national dialogue around what racism is and how do we address it. But it also is going to start, you know, in our own families, and how we have this conversation with our families and friends about that we're no longer going to tolerate the existence of racism in this country.
I think to come back to the economic implications, the thing that's critical to me is that diversity and inclusion in America is a job half done. That if you look at the number of boards that still don't have a person of color on the board, it's an amazingly surprising number. And I think I shared some data with you on that fact. And what that means is, in that boardroom, there isn't a dialogue about that. Even when boards do have members who are women, other members of groups, the board is not holding the CEOs accountable. I think what's different this time, based on the conversations I had, is that boards are going to hold CEOs accountable to implement the actions that they have actually talked about undertaking. I think there's an opportunity for CEOs to be more involved in creating a fair and equitable society, so that the management team, the organization, is reflective of the customers that it serves.
I think there's room for all of us to improve. And that includes African Americans, includes white folks, it includes the government, it includes the private sector. You know, anything this deeply ingrained cannot be resolved just by one part of society. It requires all of us to move together to make things better.
You know, you are a key business leader and a unique voice in this. Can you give some examples as to how you're engaging in this environment, either, you know, or in your own organization, which is quite large and has, you know, tens of thousands of people, and or externally? You know, what are you doing to help move this conversation and this process along?
Well, first, within the company, to use your phrase, conversation, we had a conversation after the George Floyd incident, the tragic death. We had 7,000 of our associates, our colleagues, on, you know, a conference call, a Zoom type meeting, where we had testimonials from one of our white colleagues talking about, you know, his sense now of white privilege, talking about being the descendant of slave owners and what that felt like through the new lens, the modern lens. We had another one of our associates, up and coming, really superstar performer talking about what it was like on weekends walking around his neighborhood, having to carry identification when he was just going to the mailbox, or talking about the racism that his daughter was starting to be exposed to and her white boyfriend. And we had other testimonials. So the first thing we did was we had open and honest and frankly raw conversations here in the company, and that had a big impact on people. We've had a training program that predates the instance of this year. It's called Journey to Inclusion, where we're training everyone to focus on their own, elements of racism, perhaps intentional, unintentional types of micro racisms that might have an impact on the workplace. And so we've been focusing on that. And we've started, as a result of the George Floyd incident, a program called Be the Change, which has 4 components to it. One of them is changing through understanding. So just to focus in on yourself and how you're thinking about things. The second pillar is what we call change through dialogue, where we've had these very direct conversations and brought in outsiders to help us understand what racism might look like and feel like, outside as well as in the workplace. We've had a focus on something called change through leadership, where we're really focusing on how we can, be a leader in these conversations. And then, the fourth pillar is what we're calling change through action, where we're out volunteering in our communities, and we're also doing matching grants to a number of organizations that are focused on racial justice. So, the first thing that we've done is internally get the company aligned and really start to make a difference. And then obviously I've had the chance to speak out, from time to time in the public as well, telling some of my stories and hopefully creating both a sense of realism about how serious this challenge is of racism in America, and a sense of optimism that indeed, we can, through perseverance, constructive work, dialogue, and honesty, try to make a forward move, because this time really has to be different.
These leaders do need to have trusted people that they can talk to and run stuff by and, get our view. And so that to me was kind of an important first step. And what it did then was, kind of open the door to a series of conversations then that I've been having over this last couple of weeks. And kind of what's also been interesting to me is like, they're all having great ideas and undertaking important sets of actions, but there's not been a lot of coordination, at least that I've seen, and cross-sharing. Like, weeks into the COVID epidemic, it was impressive the way the accounting firms and the law firms organized forums for directors to get together to kind of share best practices and how does the board respond to a crisis in this way, and how do we think about it. And it was meaningfully helpful. That didn't exist for this particular crisis. And again, I think it just speaks to, there's an awkwardness about race as a conversation that we need to get over at the end of the day. And, so the way I'm best able to do that is kind of through one-to-one human interaction with the folks that I work with. There's a larger question about, how we can kind of institutionalize some of that, because clearly the conversations need to happen. It's a big old elephant in the room. And mostly the only way I know to kind of work through stuff is to talk it through. But we've got a ways to go on that.
We've started internally with our staff and having these conversations. And I hosted just last week a 90-minute conversation with our colleagues all around the country, all of whom are teleworking during this COVID-19. And I think we had close to 2,000 of our staff members on the phone listening in. But I offered staff the opportunity to send in a 60-second video. We had quite a few, and we actually showed every single video that was submitted by the staff in terms of a conversation. Many of them submitted by African-American staff members who sort of describe what they experience every day. And I can't tell you how powerful that was, but, out of that came this, and we're working on this now of, how will AARP play in this? How will we address disparities across this country? And obviously, with COVID-19, what came to the forefront is a huge deficiency in terms of health disparities, particularly for those people of color, Black and brown in this country, and the idea of the how fragile our social support system is in this country, so that within a matter of weeks, 30 million people no longer had health insurance. And so what you're going to see AARP doing is being more aggressive in addressing the issue of disparities, whether it's through our advocacy work here in Washington or in state capitals all across this country, both in the health space and also in the financial space, because so many of our members really were laid off during this pandemic and what's going on in the country right now. But we know that they particularly the number of people who have died in nursing homes have been overwhelmingly African American. I think 25% of all of those who died in nursing homes were African American. And so we're going to be putting our voice and our advocacy around those disparities, issues that affect Black and brown people all over this country.
Well, I think companies have to recognize that they have to not only focus on their business in the context of profitability. And I think we saw this in the announcement that the Business Roundtable had recently, which recognized that stakeholders played a key role, not to the exclusion of shareholders, but in support of creating value for shareholders. What that means is that companies have to focus much more on increasing the availability. They have to get involved in the educational system in meaningful ways. They have to get more involved in issues of social justice. Companies are going to have to go back to what executives did 20 or 30 years ago, when companies, organizations like the Conference Board didn't just focus on their company, they focused on making society more equitable and more fair, which created opportunities for people like me.
We both were CEOs at the same time, and I always struggled with what should be my role as a CEO. And I think you and I both agree that CEOs shouldn't just wander into politics aimlessly, but this is something different. I mean, this is really an important time for society, for business leaders to engage with political leaders in society, and also for employees. But what is the right balance here? What role should CEOs play? Because primarily, they have accountability to multiple constituents, certainly their owners, shareholders, and so forth, but also employees and their customers and broader society. So where's the balance, and what is the right role?
Well, I think companies have to be selective and target. You're absolutely right that the CEO can't be all things. But for example, in my case, as you recall, as a healthcare company, we focused very much on healthcare, and we focused on trying to make certain that there was increased insurance, increased availability of healthcare services, and that no one would go without health insurance. Now, we didn't accomplish everything we thought we would like to accomplish, but we significantly were active in making certain more people got insurance. So I think the answer is think about your industry, think about your employees. One thing, for example, I talked to a company about is more pro bono work. I was talking to a private equity group a few days ago. They have a collection of the smartest, most knowledgeable financial people around. And I asked, how much time do you spend helping women and minority-owned business improve their performance? Does anyone spend any time bringing that expertise into that community to help them do better? The answer was no. And imagine if across the private equity community or the financial community, that expertise was broadly shared with businesses that didn't have the benefit of that kind of expertise. So there's a lot employees can do, but employees need the permission of the company to know that's okay to do. The one other point I would make is increase on-ramps. And what that means is that in many instances, companies want to hire someone who is exactly like the person who had the job last. That often excludes a lot of people, women, people of color, or people who have 85% of what you need, but not 100%.
Yeah.
When you build an on-ramp, you build a program and capability to fill that 15%. What you'll find is they will be some of your star performers and they'll be much more loyal.
I think that it's always helpful for CEOs to have people that they can go through, not only externally with other CEOs, but to have conversations with your internal staff. And so we had launched 8 months ago a new version of a diversity and inclusion council, and we decided that we will let them lead this conversation inside the organization about how we will make those change. But I think more important is the opportunity to listen to your employees and to move quickly, but not too quickly that you're checking a box versus making systemic change. One of the things that we've initiated this week is I've asked Human Resources to conduct a disparities in salary survey across all of AARP, so that while we think that we are a great place to work and we're one of the world's most ethical organizations, and all of the numbers are right, we know that we still have some issues that we need to address. And so that's one way that we're going to address it. And I think the other is really to make sure that your board and your senior staff and those in managerial positions reflect the diversity of your staff across the board. But being able to email or call your CEO, I bet I've received literally hundreds and hundreds of emails or texts from staff members saying, in my 20 or 30 years at AARP, this has been the most powerful conversation we have ever had, and that it's a safe place for us to have a conversation on difficult topics. Racism is not an easy thing to talk about, and it's draining, it's stressful to be able to go through it. And I think that having that mix of CEO experience with surrounding yourself with the right people and diverse opinions across the organization will help people along this path.
Again, back to BCDC, like there are these 3 categories that you should be kind of thinking about and asking yourself, what am I doing? And it's 3 Ps: people, philanthropy, and purchasing. So that's, kind of tactically, those are really good categories to start. But how we talk about it is kind of a deeper conversation. And so one of the pieces of advice that I have given, because it's not just the CEOs themselves, but their direct reports kind of want to know. They don't want to run afoul of, and have HR write them up for saying something. So just one of the things, I think is generally safe is listening and checking in. And so in one case, for example, the company wanted to, and the CEO and her direct reports kind of wanted to be able to engage with employees, but didn't know exactly what to say and didn't want to, create problems. So they were looking at like having a whole anti-bias training and bringing people in from all over the country and in the meanwhile, that's going to take weeks to organize. And if in those several weeks you've gone silent, you've actually exacerbated the problem. So, when in doubt, just kind of checking in and saying, how are you doing? This is a complicated time. I can't begin to know what you're experiencing, but how are you doing? As you would do, by the way, if somebody was going through a difficult time in their marriage or, with a health issue or, like you check in one human to another. Well, that still works. So I think when in doubt, at a minimum, checking in, letting people know you're available, and listening. There's a lot of good listening to be had right in through here.
Act on your instinct. Back in the 40s and the 50s, and you well understand this because the Conference Board has been an important part of it, as well as your think tank, CED. CEOs used to feel confident speaking out, standing up. And the last 15 or 20 or 30 years, the concept of CEOs as thought leaders has certainly, fallen off. So the first thing I'd advise is get that confidence back that you need to be a thought leader. You need to be in the dialogue. You need to be, part of the conversation. Secondly, I would say be confident about working with, I would use the word a professional, sort of understand how one approaches this by talking to folks who may be able to guide you, a little bit to avoid some of the potential pitfalls that do exist. The third thing that I'd say it's really important is be authentic. Right? This is a time for people to really talk about what they believe, what their fundamental values are, the America they want to see. There can't be a wrong way to say that. I don't think one should fear backlash by being authentic, by being transparent, by being, the person of good intention that you are. Even if you maybe, misuse a word or a phrase here, the authenticity comes through. And particularly in this era of social media, I don't know quite how it works, but I think people have a chance to sense authenticity and avoid, therefore, being overly scripted. While you want to maybe work with a coach or someone who can sort of help you make sure you get the words right, at the end of the day, the message has to come from the heart as well as the head. And so, being authentic, being transparent is really quite important. And the final thing I'd say is make sure that your internal actions and communications are quite consistent with your external actions and communications. A place where CEOs can get into trouble is to take a bold external perspective and then not have taken care of things back home, so to speak, in the company. And so I'd make sure that, one can talk confidently about how you are approaching inclusion and diversity, equity, and fairness in your own organization to create a sense of validity about what you're saying and avoid the risk of, the glass house, so to speak. So, just 2 or 3 or 4 ideas. I'm not sure that any of them are perfect for everybody. In fact, I'm sure that they probably are not perfect for any one person. But, think about any of those things and figure out which one might help you, get the confidence to speak up about something that's so incredibly important in which all Americans have a stake.
There is certainly much at stake for all of us. So thank you, Steve, Roger, Joanne, Gabby, and Ron, for weighing in here on the most pressing issues facing our country today. This is not the end of our conversation about building a more civil and just society. Please stay tuned as this conference board continues to convene the nation's most prominent CEOs in this digital format so that we can bring their ideas and solutions forward. For more on this important project, please visit our website, www.conference-board.org. Thank you.